Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris. During his decades of sometimes controversial service to the U.S. government, John Negroponte has worn numerous hats. From serving as ambassador to Honduras during the Cold War, ambassador to the UN in the lead-up to the Iraq War, U.S. ambassador to Iraq immediately after the handover of power, and in 2005, Negroponte was appointed America's first intelligence czar. As director of national intelligence, he was charged with coordinating the country's intelligence community, something that's proven to be no easy feat. And in this coming fall, he will be a lecturer at Yale University in the International Affairs Department, and he joins me now on the interview. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. I'd first like to get to your perspective on the events in Iran and the reported second victory of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Really, internal conflict aside, it's been argued that over the past years, his regime and Iran has been empowered in the region by the U.S. failure to stabilize Iraq. In other words, the invasion that you initially supported ended up providing greater influence for Iran in the region. Do you believe that is true to an extent?
I'm not entirely certain, but there's certainly no question that in the past several years, Iran's behavior has been very much against U.S. and I believe the international community's interests in the Middle Eastern region, both through the enrichment program that they have of enriching nuclear fuel in support of what I believe is a military nuclear program, and through the support, the export of violence beyond their borders to such countries as Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza, and even in Iraq, where they were supporting extremist elements there. So I think their behavior has not been constructive, and I believe that this is an issue and a problem that the international community has to deal with.
Whether or not you feel their behavior is constructive for Iraq's or Iran's own purposes, I mean, still the argument remains that Iran was handed a victory of sorts because of U.S. failures in Iraq. So do you perhaps regret what the U.S.
You know, people very often try to get one into a conversation of regrets and the past and whether we might have done something differently. But the fact of the matter is that either as a diplomat or as a commentator, I think one really has to focus on the future and where we go from here. I mean, my whole career has been one where I had to deal with situations and what to do about them going forward, irrespective of whether I agreed or disagreed with how we got there in the first place. So I think that's what confronts us now, and I would leave to the historians the issue of whether this might have been, the invasion of Iraq might or might not have been a mistake. I'm on record personally as having said that I thought we could have waited and that I thought we were in a bit of a hurry to get in Iraq and we should have given more time to the inspection regime that I played a role in negotiating at the United Nations in the form of Resolution 1441.
I'd like to come back to that, but I mean, if we look at the present and toward the future, what do you make of how the Obama administration is handling events in Iran?
Well, I think the Obama administration has gotten off to a very good start in foreign policy. They've moved very quickly to make a number of key decisions, and we may come back to some of those different areas. But as far as Iran is concerned, I think he has played his cards very, very skillfully. I think if he were to comment too publicly, I think we would run the risk of us becoming the issue rather than the situation in Iran. And the authorities in Iran might try to use the issue as a way of mobilizing some kind of defensive nationalistic reaction. So I think his posture has been very, very correct.
You say that while key members still of the Republican Party, John McCain, for example, argue that now is the opportunity for the United States to step up, defend democracy, back Mir Hossein Mousavi in this scenario in order to bring greater democratic freedoms to Iran. You don't think that's what you mean?
Certainly we would like to see the vote of the Iranian people respected. We would like to see democracy and freedom advance in Iran. I think the issue is one of tactics, how best to do that. And is the interest of freedom and democracy better served by us taking a sort of a vocal position center stage, or is it to leave it to the Iranians themselves? I'm not aware that Iranian oppositionists are asking for the United States to intervene at this particular time.
I'd like to go back to Iraq then and just ask how disappointed you are with the instability and the corruption that has persisted and increased since the invasion.
I was the first United States ambassador to Iraq after we turned back the exercise of sovereignty of the government of Iraq. And when you think about the situation back then, which was the end of June 2004, exactly 5 years ago, and you compare the situation then to the situation now, I would submit to you that there's been substantial improvement. The Iraqis had no army to speak of at that time. No, the police and the army were in complete disarray. A lot has been done to re-establish those forces and put them in a position to exercise better security in the country. There's been several elections, political elections, each one progressively conducted on a wider scale and more effectively than the previous one. So there's certainly problems that remain, to be sure. But if you compare the situation to either 2004 or 2006, when Iraq was on the verge of a civil war and they had plunged into serious sectarian violence, I would suggest to you that the situation has improved.
Let me ask you about the Department of National Intelligence, which arose out of what some called the failure of U.S. intelligence agencies to determine whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That bureau now is seeing serious inter-bureaucratic fighting. It's been criticized as being bloated and ineffective. And some are saying now it's actually compromising the effectiveness of U.S. intelligence. What do you think? Do you think it's actually strengthened?
Well, first, as to why it was created, I think its genesis was twofold. One was the 9/11 attack and the 9/11 Commission report, which criticized United States intelligence for not having had sufficient information sharing and integration of our intelligence horizontally across the different intelligence agencies. And then secondly, as you suggest, the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction fiasco, where we incorrectly assessed there to be a weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq. I was the first director of national intelligence. I set up the organization from scratch. We had nobody. There was not even a secretary and a desk when I first arrived into an organization of about 1,500 people. I think there's been progress in terms of integration of information, intelligence sharing. We've strengthened this National Counterterrorism Center, which integrates 26 different databases from all of the intelligence community. And I think that there's a general acceptance that there's much better intelligence sharing across our intelligence community than there was prior to 9/11.
But the scenario over the intelligence on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was later proven to be very faulty.
Correct.
It could technically happen again.
But I think the safeguards, we put a lot into. One of the things that happened was that there's a body called the National Intelligence Council, which is responsible for major assessments of this kind. That was brought under the authority of the Director of National Intelligence. We've installed different kinds of techniques to make sure that there's alternative analysis done, the tough questions are asked, conclusions are severely tested so that we're much more, I think there's a higher level of confidence in the assessments that are made today than there was at that time. Could some of these things happen again? Perhaps.
Just down to our last couple minutes, I wanted to ask you about what happened on Friday. The United States signing on to the UN Human Rights Council, something it avoided for years, mainly based on its allegations of bias against Israel. Are you happy the U.S. is now on board?
I think we're always well served to participate in multilateral organizations. If I had somewhat of a point of difference with some of my colleagues in the previous administration, It was that they underappreciated, in my opinion, the United Nations and what it could do to help advance United States national interests. I've always felt that we ought to participate in these organizations. I think the peacekeeping missions that the UN has carried out, many of them have been quite effective, like in Sierra Leone or Liberia. And I think this Human Rights Council, where we're debating an issue in which the United States has a long historical interest, the whole question of democracy and human freedom, we should be at the table. And we shouldn't be afraid to participate in those kinds of organizations. So I welcome this development.
John Negroponte, one last question. You've served during some of the most scrutinized and criticized periods of U.S. foreign policy. Do you have any regrets?
Not really, no. I had a really wonderful career. I had 44 years of government service, and in the Bush administration, I was given extraordinary opportunities by the president, at first as ambassador to the UN, then to Iraq, then setting up this new intelligence organization. And lastly, the opportunity for 2 years to serve as Deputy Secretary of State in an agency and an organization that I knew extremely well and grew to love very dearly.
What about your time serving Reagan in Central America?
Well, it was a great administration. I get criticized at times, but I believe it's because I carried out the president's policies, not because of anything I did personally. And if you look at what happened in Central America thereafter, developments have been reasonably positive. And then I have a personal reason to be very satisfied with my time in Honduras, which is that I have 5 adopted Honduran children who are doing just fine. Thank you very much.
Okay, John Negroponte, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. For this edition of The Interview, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.